It's a funny thing about the game of Monopoly.
Oh, definitely.
Like if you sit down at the table, right, and three of the other players have been rolling the dice for, I don't know, an hour before you even got there.
Yeah, they've already bought everything up.
Exactly. They have the orange properties, the red ones. They're already putting hotels on Park Place.
Right. And your chances of winning in that scenario are basically zero.
Zero.
Oh.
I mean, you just spend the entire game paying rent until you inevitably, go bankrupt.
It is a fundamentally brutal game, really, and a remarkably accurate simulation of how a massive portion of the population currently views the modern property market.
Yeah. Which brings us to today. Because
Right.
if you are listening to this and looking at your own property portfolio, or maybe you're just staring at online property listings wondering how you will ever afford a home, this document we are exploring today was written about you.
So, welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are looking directly at the Australian government's official tax explainer on the budget 2026-27 reforms. Specifically, the massive changes to negative gearing and capital gains tax.
Huge changes.
Yeah, and this was released just days ago on May 12, 2026. The mission of this deep dive is to, well, cut through all the bureaucratic financial jargon and map out exactly how these sweeping changes rewrite the rules of property and investment in this country.
Because reading through the Treasury modeling, I mean, it becomes incredibly clear that this is not just some routine tax update.
Right.
This is a drastic government intervention into what they are explicitly framing as a generational housing crisis.
Okay, let's unpack this, because before we get into the complex math of, how they are actually changing the rules, we have to look at the scoreboard that made the government panic in the first place. Like, what is the burning platform here? You really just have to look at the historical data the government highlights right at the top of their briefing. They point out that since 1999, housing prices have risen more than twice as fast as average full-time earnings.
Twice as fast.
Yeah.
So if your salary went up by, say, $50 a week,
Right.
the house you're trying to save for went up by 100.
Exactly. And that gap compounds every single year for a quarter of a century.
Wow.
And the human cost of that mathematical reality is stark. The document notes that between 2001 and 2021, the homeownership rate for 25 to 34-year-olds dropped by a massive 7 percentage points.
That's a huge demographic shift.
It really is. A whole cohort of working-age people is simply locked out of the market because their wages, well, they could just never catch up to asset inflation.
So the government has laid out 3 explicit policy goals to try and fix this. Number 1, level the playing field for first-home buyers. Number 2, preserve the existing gains that current investors have already made.
Wow.
And number 3, support investment in new housing supply. But going back to that monopoly analogy, I mean, does tweaking a few lines of the tax code actually reset the board for those 25 to 34-year-olds? Or does it just change how the bank collects its fees?
See, that is the crucial tension of this entire policy document. The government's perspective, as outlined in these reforms, is that the current tax system acts as an engine that actively encourages highly leveraged property investments.
Okay.
As it stands right now, investors often receive greater structural tax advantages than regular owner-occupiers who are, just trying to buy a place to live.
Yeah.
The system effectively subsidizes investors to outbid prospective homeowners at an auction.
If we connect this to the bigger picture.
Oh, wait, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the Treasury modeling predicts this will create 75,000 additional owner-occupiers over the next decade.
75,000.
Yeah, effectively reversing 10 years of declining homeownership rates.
Let's test that logic then. To hit that 75,000 homeowner goal, the first major lever the government is pulling is negative gearing. And they're doing a massive pivot here.
They really are.
They're shifting the focus from buying old houses to building new ones.
This is the absolute core of the negative gearing shakeup.
Just to ground this for anyone listening who isn't fluent in, tax accounting, if my rental property brings in $20,000 a year in rent, but my mortgage interest and maintenance costs $30,000, I am $10,000 in the red.
Right. You're making a loss.
Exactly. And negative gearing lets me take that $10,000 paper loss and subtract it from my day job salary, so I pay significantly less income tax.
Yes.
The government is essentially helping me pay the holding costs of my investment.
That is the exact mechanism. And because Australia has relatively high marginal tax rates, high-income earners rely heavily on that deduction.
Oh, totally.
But under the new rules, starting from the 1st of July 2027, this stops entirely for established property.
Right, entirely.
Entirely. If you buy an existing older house after the announcement date and take a loss on it, you can no longer deduct that loss against your salary.
Wow.
You can only deduct it against other income from residential properties or against future capital gains when you eventually sell.
Though the source notes those excess losses aren't just vaporized, right? Like you can carry them forward.
Right. Well,
Like if you spend a large amount on a new roof and take a massive loss one year, you bank that loss and use it to offset rental income in future years.
yeah, that carry forward mechanism is critical. It ensures landlords can still afford to maintain their properties without going bankrupt on cash flow, but it removes that immediate taxpayer subsidy against their wage income.
But then we get to the giant flashing neon exemption in the document, which is new builds.
Oh, yes.
If you're an investor and you buy a genuinely new build, you can still negatively gear it against your salary, exactly like the old rules.
Yeah.
It's like a bring-your-own-chair VIP club. The government is basically saying, you can still get the VIP tax perks, but only if you physically bring a new house to the market.
That analogy perfectly captures the behavioral economics at play here. It's incredibly targeted.
How targeted?
Well, the document notes that only about 1% of tax filers, that's around 230,000 people in the 2022-23 year, acquire negatively geared properties each year.
Oh, 1%.
Just 1%. But the behavioral psychology here is huge. They are forcing that specific investment capital toward brand new construction rather than just bidding up existing stock. And the definition of a new build is extremely strict.
I was going to ask about that. What actually counts?
It has to genuinely add to the overall housing supply. So constructing a dwelling on vacant land counts.
Okay.
Buying a single freestanding house, knocking it down, and building a duplex counts because you're adding a net new dwelling to the market.
But what if I just add a couple of bedrooms to my existing investment property? Or slap a granny flat in the backyard?
The document explicitly rules that out. Extensions and granny flats next to established properties do not count.
Really?
Yeah, and you also can't just buy a newly built house from another investor a year later. It has to be newly constructed, having not been previously sold as a residence.
So how does this actually translate into houses getting built? Like, if I'm an investor, how does my tax break swing a hammer?
It works through project financing. Most large residential developments just cannot get bank funding to break ground until they have pre-sold a certain percentage of the units off the plan.
Oh.
Investors, motivated by this new negative gearing tax break, provide those pre-sales. They sign the contracts, the developer takes those contracts to the bank releases the capital, and the building gets built.
I see.
The government is taking those 230,000 individuals who utilize negative gearing each year and aggressively funneling their capital away from existing homes.
Okay, so the government has basically built a legislative wall around existing homes to keep investors out, leaving them for regular home buyers. But what happens to the investors who are already inside? Let's talk about the exact moment they decide to sell, because this brings us to the second massive overhaul in the document, which is the death of the 50% capital gains tax discount.
This is arguably an even bigger shift in the macroeconomic landscape than the negative gearing changes.
Really? Bigger.
Primarily because it applies so broadly.
Right. Because the 50% CGT discount has been the bedrock of Australian investing since 1999.
Yep.
If you hold an asset for more than 12 months, you basically only pay tax on half the profit.
Yeah.
But the government is scrapping it entirely.
Completely gone.
Instead, they're replacing it with two intersecting rules. First, cost-based indexation, which is tied to the Consumer Price Index. And second, a brand new 30% minimum tax rate on real capital gains.
That's right.
And they're keeping the settings asset neutral. So that applies to investment properties, share portfolios, managed funds, basically all capital assets.
With a few targeted exemptions, of course. The family home, your main residence, is still completely exempt from capital gains tax. Small business concessions remain unchanged. And affordable housing keeps its existing 60% discount.
To preserve the incentive for investors providing low-income shelter.
Exactly.
I have to push back on the mechanics of this indexation rule, though.
Okay, go ahead.
Let's say I buy an asset for $100,000. Over 10 years, I sell it for $125,000.
Right.
But inflation over that exact decade was exactly 25%. Under the new indexation rule, my original purchase price gets adjusted up to match inflation.
Correct.
So my real gain is calculated as zero. Wait, so if I buy an asset and over 10 years it only goes up by the exact rate of inflation under the new indexation rule, do I pay zero tax? Isn't that a massive tax break for some investors?
It is a tax break in that specific scenario, and the Treasury document actually validates your math entirely.
Really?
Yes, the government argues that the old 50% discount was a blunt instrument that completely distorted how inflation was treated. It overcompensated some and undercompensated others.
Okay, I can see that.
By indexing the original purchase price to the CPI, the government is making a philosophical tax argument. They only want to tax you on the real economic value you generated above and beyond everyday inflation.
That makes sense.
If an asset just matches inflation, your purchasing power hasn't actually increased. You aren't any wealthier in terms of what you can actually buy in the real world, so you shouldn't be taxed on phantom growth.
Right, it protects low-growth assets from being penalized by inflation. But then they bring the hammer down on the other end with this new 30% minimum tax rate.
What's fascinating here is how the 30% minimum tax floor is designed to close a very specific behavioral loophole.
Huh.
Historically, high-wealth individuals might hold on to an asset for decades, experiencing massive capital growth.
Sure.
Then they strategically wait to sell it during a financial year when they have taken time off work or maybe they retired, and their marginal income tax rate drops to almost nothing.
Ah. So they manipulate their income year to wash away the tax burden on a massive gain.
Exactly. The 30% minimum tax floor forces them to pay a rate that is more commensurate with what working-age people pay on their wages, regardless of how low their income is in that specific year.
Wow.
Now, the government is careful to note that vulnerable populations like recipients of the age pension or job seeker will be completely exempted from this 30% floor.
If they receive a welfare payment in the year, they realize the gain.
Yes. But for wealthy investors trying to defer and dodge taxes, the floor is very solid.
Rather than getting lost in abstract percentages, let's look at the specific scenarios provided by the Treasury in this document. Because we know the rules now, but what does this actually look like in people's bank accounts?
Yeah, the Treasury provided some very illustrative cameos to show exactly who wins and who loses under this indexation system.
Let's talk about Ben, David, and Kate.
Yeah.
They all buy a comparable asset, hold it for 10 years, and have the exact same base salary. But their assets perform differently. Ben gets a low return, just 2.5% a year, basically just matching inflation. Under the old 50% discount, he still would have paid tax on half his profit.
Yes.
But under the new indexation rules, his real gain is negligible. So Ben actually pays about $24,858 less in tax.
Which perfectly illustrates the protection of low-yield, stable investments we just talked about.
Yeah.
But then look at David. David gets a median return of 5%, which the document notes is similar to longer-term historical returns on residential real estate.
Okay.
Because his gain outpaces inflation, he pays an extra $8,075 in tax compared to the old system.
And then there's Kate. Kate is the high roller.
Oh, yeah.
She gets a 7.5% annual return on a high-growth asset. Her real above-inflation gains are massive because the old 50% discount would have shielded half of that massive profit. Losing that discount hurts her significantly.
Very significantly.
Kate ends up paying a whopping $58,851 more in tax.
That is the price of a luxury car just vaporized from her returns because she lost that discount.
Wait, let's also talk about the minimum tax cameo. Jack.
Jack.
Jack earns $25,000 but makes a $10,000 capital gain. His normal tax rate would be 14%, but the new rule forces him to top it up to 30%. So he's paying an extra $1,600.
It is a very clear wealth redistribution mechanism based on asset performance. It heavily penalizes high-yield, speculative investments and protects low-yield, inflation-matching ones.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Because Australia isn't just making this up in a vacuum.
No, they aren't.
The OECD actually told them to do this to fix their system. Reading the international comparison section, Australia is basically adopting a blueprint handed to them by the OECD to fix the structural efficiency of their entire tax system.
The government is very clearly leveraging international economic consensus to validate what is, quite frankly, going to be a highly controversial domestic policy.
And what does this do to the broader housing market? The Treasury is predicting a temporary slowing in house price growth. They estimate prices will grow by about 2% less over a couple of years than they would have without the policy.
Yeah.
That lower price growth is theoretically what allows those 75,000 first-home buyers to enter the market. But what about the renters? Like, if investors stop buying existing homes, doesn't the rental supply dry up?
The Treasury modeling addresses this directly. They suggest the reforms will have a surprisingly small impact on rents, an expected increase of less than $2 per week for a household paying median rent.
Less than $2.
Yeah, and the document is quick to balance that figure by pointing out that the government previously increased Commonwealth rent assistance by more than $20 per week for single people on the maximum rate.
Okay.
They are essentially arguing the net financial position for vulnerable renters remains positive.
Wait a minute. That math only works if you are on welfare. Rent assistance only goes to people receiving government support. What about, say, a 26-year-old nurse working full-time who doesn't qualify for a cent of welfare?
Right.
Don't they just have to eat that rent hike because investors are fleeing the market and the supply of existing rentals shrinks?
That is a highly valid critique of the Treasury's macro view. The government's counterargument is that as those 75,000 renters transition into becoming homeowners, it frees up the rental properties they leave behind.
Balancing the supply and demand equation over the long term.
Exactly. But you are right to point out that in the short term, a working professional renter sees no benefit from welfare offsets. They just see a tighter market.
Well, with changes this massive, you can't just flip a switch overnight without crashing the economy. That leads us to the meticulous and, honestly, somewhat complicated transitional arrangements.
Transitioning a national tax system is incredibly delicate. The primary goal of the transition rules in this document is to prevent asset market disruption. If they just flipped a switch, you would see a sudden fire sale of properties as investors panicked, which would sink regular homeowners into negative equity.
Or you'd see a mad buying frenzy.
Exactly.
So they created a magic date, 7.3 d.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time on the 12th of May, 2026, the exact moment the budget was announced.
Yep.
If you held a property before that exact minute, it is fully grandfathered for negative gearing.
By protecting what people already have, the government avoids punishing past decisions made under the old rules. They're acknowledging that people signed 30-year mortgages based on those old rules, and pulling the rug out retroactively would be economically catastrophic.
Then there's this strange limbo period. If you buy an established property between May 12, 2026 and June 30, 2027, you can negatively gear it.
Yes.
But only until July 1st, 2027.
Correct.
After that date, you are forced onto the new rules.
And the capital gains tax transition is where the mechanics get incredibly complex.
Okay, lay it on me.
For assets owned before July 1st, 2027, the gains you make up to that specific date get the old 50% discount.
Right.
But any gains made after that date fall under the new indexation and 30% floor rules.
It's like taking a massive financial snapshot of the entire country, or, like saving your progress in a video game before the difficulty gets turned up to expert mode.
That's a great way to put it.
You lock in all your financial progress up to July 1st, 2027 under the easy, heavily discounted rules. Then everything after that is played on a harder level.
Exactly.
But practically speaking, how does the government know what my house or my share portfolio was worth on exactly July 1st, 2027 if I don't actually sell the asset up till, say, 2035?
Taxpayers will need a valuation. When you eventually sell years down the line, you will have to calculate the asset's exact value on July 1st, 2027.
Oh, boy.
For shares, that's relatively easy. You just look at the quoted market price on that specific day. But for an illiquid asset like a house, you can either get a formal, independent valuation done around that date, or the Australian Taxation Office is going to provide an apportionment formula.
Apportionment formula.
Basically, a mathematical tool from the ATO that looks at your total capital growth over the entire period you held the property, looks at the transition date, and estimates what the value was on July 1st, 2027. It smooths out the curve.
That sounds like an absolute gold rush for tax accountants.
Oh, it undoubtedly will be. This raises an important question, though, regarding how early stage and tech startups will survive this.
Oh, true. Because tech startups usually don't pay dividends or offer steady yields.
No, they don't.
The entire incentive for an early-stage investor to take a huge financial risk on an unproven startup is a promise of a massive capital gain down the road.
Precisely. If you replace the 50% CGT discount with inflation indexation, you severely penalize those high-growth, high-risk tech investments, just like we saw with Kate in the Treasury cameo. The government realizes this could completely chill venture capital and innovation in the country. So the source explicitly states the government will have to consult separately on how this impacts the startup sector.
They basically published the housing fix before solving the innovation puzzle.
They did.
So what does this all mean? We've covered a massive amount of ground today. If we pull all the economic threads together, The Australian government is fundamentally rewiring the incentive structures of property investment.
They absolutely are.
They are favoring building over buying and taxing real economic gains over paper inflation. If you hold capital assets, you really need to remember to consult the ATO tools when the time comes to calculate your own asset values for that July 1st, 2027 transition date.
It is a profound shift, and it leaves you with a philosophical question to ponder.
What's that?
Well, a nation's tax code is essentially a blueprint of its societal priorities. For a quarter of a century, the code prioritized the wealth generation of property investors. Now it's pivoting toward housing access for the young. The question isn't just whether this will work mathematically, but how history will judge the transition. Does changing the rules halfway through the game fix the underlying inequality? Or does it just create a new class of winners who got grandfathered in at the perfect moment?
A massive question that will probably take another 25 years to definitively answer. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive today. Keep learning, and we'll see you next time.